what's more important to us? Is it going to school, figuring out an education at the cost of potentially not being there for our daughter? And we just said, listen, it doesn't matter how much money we ever have in our lives. What matters is that we have a home that's full of love and that we support our kids and we give them the best opportunities possible. And that followed a very open discussion with my wife about, do you want to work? You want me to work? But one of us should just stay home and we'll save the money on daycare. And she's always had a natural caregiving personality. So she was like, I want to stay home. And we were like, great. And after that point, I started working 2 or 3 jobs and figuring out how to make sure that I had time at home. But they were all, delivering pizza, working at a pizza shop or a restaurant, or taking odd jobs where I could get it. I did moving and whatever else I could do on the weekend or anything else. But I think the most important thing that we took away was what's most important is our family, the kids, and creating a positive environment at home. And then everything else we'll figure out.
Welcome to the Front Row Dads podcast. My name is Kasim, and I am deeply honored to be the guest podcast host today. While there's no substitute for John Vroman, I'm going to do my best. I've been a longtime member of Front Row Dads, which I view as something of a mastermind for men that want to be better husbands, better fathers. If this is your first time listening, the mantra here is family men with businesses, not businessmen with families. And I'm hoping the conversation that we have today helps arm you a little bit with some tools and insights and honestly, some wisdom is the word that I'm going to use. That's what I expect to happen today, because the person that I've asked to join me is one of the people that I go to with my biggest problems, and that's been true for the majority of my life. His name is Farhan Rizvi. Farhan is my cousin on my father's side. He's husband to Patricia, father to Nasim, Jordan, and Caden. He lives in Issaquah, Washington, senior director over at T-Mobile. Farhan, I appreciate you being here.
Thanks, man. Happy to be here.
Yeah. It's funny. I got a text message from the Front Row Dads crew saying, hey, we want you to do a guest podcast for FRD, and we want you to interview another dad. And at the risk of pandering, you're the best father I know.
Oh,
you're the best father I know personally. I don't know many people. That's exactly right. Dude, it's funny though. It's actually, here's what's funny. I'm going to make this compliment backhanded. It was a little depressing. It was a little depressing when I thought, like, man, the bar is high. I got to get the biggest, baddest dude that I know, who wears this hat. And it's interesting how, and I don't want to start off in a negative zone, but I'll say, just for the sake of humanity and to take some of the pressure off, it's interesting how few people prioritize that role until it's too late, let's say. And I feel like you, right out of the gate, just came out swinging as a dad. That was my impression. And I got to see you, you're what, 11 years older than me, 12 years older than me?
Yep.
So I got to see you early, something like that.
Yeah.
Old, and like we're kind of in the same generation, but not,
Right.
And just for anybody listening, Fran's got a really amazing story. I'm going to characterize your childhood as rough. You lost your mom when you were what, 12?
13
years old.
Yep.
And I've never heard another human being spoken of as highly as your mother. Like, anybody who ever met her talks about the gem of a human that she was. And I imagine that deepens the sense of loss. I hope it's fair to say, but for varying reasons, you were on your own, more or less. Dad wasn't really around, and there wasn't much in the way of like guidance or paternal or maternal figures.
Yeah, I think that's a very fair statement. It's funny because I always describe it to people as my father was a great compliment to my mother, but as a single parent, a little bit of a failure. Like, it just didn't work. I don't think he was ever wired to be a parent. He was wired to be a dad. When my mom was there to be a parent is how I would describe it. So after her passing, I think in a lot of instances, his approach was, well, you were doing fine before, so I'm not going to get too involved, which he told me years later, which I just thought, I just thought that approach makes zero sense to me, right? Because there was nobody else there. Because it was definitely a sense of, after my mom passed with my father, there was a sense of like there was apathy or indifference, which in some cases is sometimes worse than abuse. You know what I mean? Because you're just like, all right, I guess I'm on my own. So it's interesting. Like, I would definitely describe it as being on my own pretty early. And it was me and my older brother that were kind of, all right, let's figure stuff out, even down to, hey, let's figure out what we're going to eat today, because there weren't any meals provided at the house, right? So it was interesting challenges that we started to deal with really early.
Now, I remember you telling me stories about like ketchup sandwiches.
Yep. Yes, because there was often times where there was nothing but like a loaf of white bread and ketchup in the fridge, and that was it. So, right, like instead of eating plain bread, just threw some ketchup on it, and that's all I ate in the day.
Yeah. And looking back on that now, has your perspective changed as you've watched your children traverse that same epoch? And let me buttress that statement a little bit. When I remembered myself at 7, 8, 9, 10, in my 20s and 30s, the way I viewed that was massively different than when I saw my son at 7, 8. And, they're not past that level yet, but you've seen 3 children now past the age of 13. And how did that, I'm just curious, how did that, I don't know if it reconciled or changed?
It's I guess from a change from a perspective of, there's a couple comments like you made earlier about the sense of loss of losing my mom, who was a gem of a human. I don't disagree with any of those statements. In fact, would endorse them pretty strongly, right? But what's interesting is over the years and over time, it's evolved into I got to have a wonderful human being influence me as a person for 13 years, which I look back and I go, hey, it was great. I wouldn't trade those 13 years for anything. And getting more years, who knows what it does to the rest of the course of my life. And so I've felt a deep sense of gratitude for having those 13 years versus a sense of loss as time has gone on. And even when I think about like my younger brother and Haas, and right, doesn't have any memory of my mom, and he was 2 when she passed. So that's where I'm like, that's where there might be a sense of loss, right? Like, he's expressed regret in not knowing her. And although I didn't get to know her nearly as much as I would have wanted to, but there's a deep sense of gratitude for the things she was able to instill in me in the 13 years. And then from the rest of the places, the food thing and whatever, right? Like, it was always a struggle and a challenge to go figure out like, where are you going to get some of those things? But it was like, the way I look at it now, it's funny because your comment about, I kind of, not as a disagreement, it's funny because I guess it's like pessimism versus optimism, right? Like, I look around and I go, holy shit, there's so many fathers I've learned things from. And I know it's fathers, but like, and mothers. I spent a lot of time with my best friend in high school, single mom, and I ate at his house a lot. So for me, like, at least the direct impact of not having food, now it's the opposite, where financially in a different position. When my kids were younger, I was like, yeah, your friends want to come over? Yes. You want to go get some, you want to have something to eat? Yes, eat whatever you want, right? Like, it didn't matter what was happening or what was there. It was just trying to pay back a little bit for all the people that helped me for when those times were hard. Same thing with giving rides. Used to drive my wife nuts because she'd be like, I don't want to drive these kids everywhere. Well, I always needed a ride. Couldn't get anywhere without a ride when I was growing up. So for me, I was like, yeah, you want a ride? Sure. Like, I'll give anybody a ride. Like, if I can make it there, I'm like, that's the least I can do. So I can figure out how to pay it forward. And over time, I've also, like, earlier, I used to see friends when I was growing up, and I'd go to their houses and I'd be like, holy shit, there's so much food, right? And pantries, I was like, I didn't even know you're supposed to put food in there, right? Like, oh my God, it's crazy. And I'm sure they hated having me come over because I ate. Like, I'd just be there. They wanted to play outside, and I'm like, hold on, let's get some food. Let's go eat. I got to eat before I go home, because otherwise I'm going to be hungry when I get home. So like, there was a lot of that happening, but as it's evolved over time, I've just sort of, I used to think so many kids had it easier than I did. And sometimes when my kids were younger, it was hard as a father to relate to what they were going through, because I was like, the things you're complaining about, I'm like, dude, like there's nothing right? You have so many more things that I did. Like you're complaining about the wrong things. But over time you learn like everybody's like their childhood wasn't necessarily easier. I'd love to say that I learned so much through my experiences that I made their experiences either. I just changed the challenges that they dealt with. So a lot of those things, it's like the hardest thing for me as a dad was to try to go back and look at their lives through their perspective and try to understand the things that were challenges for them and figure out how to support it. Because coming from my perspective, in some cases, I just pushed them way too hard because I was like, you guys got everything. Like you guys should have what you guys should be able to do, handle way more. Like you're complaining about taking a test. Like, you know, like you gotta be tougher than that, or things like that. So I think that was one of the biggest challenges from growing up, at least that I took away, and how those experiences evolved for me and translated as a dad.
I love what you said about viewing things from your children's perspective. That's a writer downer for me. Continuing your narrative, you're solo at 13. You've got a big brother who's, trying to figure his own life out. You got married at 18, right?
Yep.
First child at 19.
Yep.
And what's cool about your story, your wife, Patricia, y'all basically grew up together. I think you knew each other from what, 15, 14, 15?
Yep. Yeah.
Which is beautiful. And she was more or less by herself too, for varying reasons. And so you guys were kind of these two islands that found each other and built this life together. And I remember you telling me a story about how, you're a 19-year-old father and you and your wife sat down and just decided, look, we're never going to be rich, but we're going to be happy. Can you dive into that a little bit and the mindset behind? Because that dude, when I heard that, I was just like, oh, that's soul sucking. That feels horrible. But you just tucked right into it, dude. And you were like, all right, I'm going to do the work.
Yeah, it was lots of different experiences, but I think the biggest thing and the foundation for the relationship with my wife was all predicated on this idea of she came from a single family home, different challenges. Her mom she was one of 9 with her mom. They were also didn't have a lot and struggled in different ways. And her home life, she had siblings, there were alcohol issues, drug issues. It was a very stressful environment. Her older brother would come home drunk and bang on the door. And so it was always a state of heightened awareness, right? So she has even some PTSD from growing up in a very chaotic environment. But when we came together and when we decided to get married, it was all predicated on, well, our families can't figure out how to give us a good home. So let's go figure it out on our own. And we wanted to just build a better home for ourselves. And we both wanted to have children. And so we both knew that, hey, we want to create a better environment for our kids than the one that we had. And so when, right, I would argue we probably should have given ourselves a little bit more time. But when we had our first kid, our daughter, one of the things that we tried to do was like, okay, so can we figure out how we stay in school, how we work, how we make money? Our families weren't in a position to help us in any way, shape, or form. So we tried to work opposite shifts so we could minimize the amount of time that our daughter was in daycare. And that started to put a strain on the relationship because we didn't really see each other. We were just like passing each other in the night, and I would work in opposite shifts. So we said, this is not the life that we wanted for our kid. And we're early enough to where we're like, okay, we've had to drop out of school. We've had to figure out that we got to work and be able to make enough money to support our kids. And to that point, we just sat down and said, listen, what's the most important thing in our lives? And we were forced to, at a very young age, establish like, what are the principles that we want to live our life by? What's more important to us? Is it going to school, figuring out an education at the cost of potentially not being there for our daughter? And we just said, listen, it doesn't matter how much money we ever have in our lives. What matters is that we have a home that's full of love and that we support our kids and we give them the best opportunities possible. And that followed a very open discussion with my wife about, do you want to work? You want me to work? But one of us should just stay home and we'll save the money on daycare. And she's always had a natural caregiving personality. So she was like, I want to stay home. And we were like, great. And after that point, I started working 2 or 3 jobs and figuring out how to make sure that I had time at home. But they were all, delivering pizza, working at a pizza shop or a restaurant, or taking odd jobs where I could get it. I did moving and whatever else I could do on the weekend or anything else. But I think the most important thing that we took away was what's most important is our family, the kids, and creating a positive environment at home, and then everything else we'll figure out. And then then we were really fortunate after that, had some really great breaks, had some good opportunities, and we've been able to come out the other side and be in a really good place.
So hold on, we'll get to the happy ending in a minute, but I'm just curious because you just said something that just sparked a question. I remember going and helping you move places. Like there were people where you'd show up with me and then your brother Hassan and my brother Sammy, and we would help. Were you getting paid for our labor is my question. Was this a Tom Sawyer thing that I just now learned about?
Nope, because all the places I took you were friends and family. We helped lots of friends.
I see what happened. I don't blame you for the hustle. So that's actually one of the coolest part of your stories. I think if we made a movie about you, this would be this is kind of the eye of the tiger moment. You start working at T-Mobile at the call center in Albuquerque, New Mexico. And dude, I've worked at a couple of call centers. It is the most soul-sucking job I can possibly think of. It's like the modern day sweatshop, right? It's the closest thing that somebody in the Western world can get to a sweatshop. And you're working at this call center at the time. I remember this vividly. They're offering unlimited OT. Yeah. And so you would show up at I just 0 dark 30 and you'd stay until whatever. And they're giving you, I think time and a half or double time. So it ended up being really good money, but you had no expectation that this thing would result in anything, was the way that you told me the story. And then I'm going to flash forward and you can fill in the blanks. Flash forward 24 years later, you're senior director of T-Mobile for Business. You live in Issaquah Highlands. I hope you don't mind me saying this, but extremely successful, and have climbed the corporate ladder higher than anybody could have expected from a dropout with, at the time, no college degree, no experience, no real skills. And having started from the call center, pounding the phones. It's an unbelievable story, unbelievable hero story. Tell us a little bit about that and then how it wove into your ability to still focus and be a husband, be a dad, be a family man.
Yeah, it was really funny because one of the reasons I picked T-Mobile and my wife's younger brother worked there as well. And he was the one that told me there's unlimited OT. And I would start calculating okay, what's the opportunity? How much money can I make? And then when I started, the training was 3 weeks. And I was the only person in training because they give you a binder like this thick and you got to learn all the systems and figure out how to take a call. And after the first day, I was like, hey, I'm done. Can I take a test or something? Because can I get on the phones? Can I go work some OT? And the trainer's like, hey, just hold on. Trust me. After you get on the phones, you're going to wish you were back in training. And I was like, no, trust me. I need the OT. And so he was like, no, his name was Rolando Hall, really great guy. But he was like, nope, you got to sit here for the 3 weeks. We got to make sure you're trained ready. I was like, great. The day that training ended, I was like, can I go sign up for OT? So my first day on the phones was at the end of the training week. I took 4 hours of phone calls. And then after that, I used to work 5/12s. I worked 6 a.m. to 6 p.m. every single day for 2 years. And I think I did that as far as I took customer service calls, then I moved to tech. I took technical support calls. And that's it was really interesting because I squeezed in probably 3 years, 3.5 years of phone calls into 2 years. And that helped throughout my whole career because I could identify, I understood our systems. I could identify with the job that we had to do. I could understand what the customer issues were. And because I had a little bit of a technical mindset anyway to start with and some natural problem solving skills, when I started working on systems, when I got to HQ and I got to headquarters and started working with the IT teams, I could take business requirements and I could tell IT architects and developers hey, look, you're building it wrong. Here's what they're trying to get done. Here's what that requirement means. And it became a really strong asset as I started to support systems and started to grow my career in that direction. What became a big challenge was the amount of time, because it was really interesting. The day that I made the decision that I was going to try to make this my career, I started at a supervisor position in the call center. And I had to go have a conversation with my wife and said, listen, I want to make this a career. In order to do that, I have to take probably a $30,000 a year pay cut because the amount of OT I was working and the salary position for a supervisor, there were people, at least at that time, turning down supervisor jobs because they were like, I can't take that kind of a pay cut. For me, I could start to see that as T-Mobile grew, it's like there's no way that a normal business is going to run OpEx this way.
Right.
There's just no way. I get it. Wireless was huge. It was blowing up. Startups will do anything, but at some point it's going to go away. So I was like, I got to make a decision. And so I took a supervisor position. And I think in a few months, all the OT was like, no more unlimited OT.
And you're how old at this point? You've done this for 2 years. You're how old when you take the supervisor position?
Boy, I want to say I was about 28.
Okay. So you have all 3 kids already.
Yeah, the third kid was born while I was at T-Mobile, while I was on the phones. Yeah.
So you got a full stable at home. You take a $30,000 pay cut. How long did that last? How long did you have to live with that?
I had some good opportunities in the sense of like I started working a job for the weekends to make extra money to try to supplement that income a little bit. So that helped, but that just meant more hours. So trying to balance at that point, I had no time to work out. So I literally I'd go play basketball at the YMCA for the hour of my lunch. So instead of eating, I'd go play basketball to get some sort of exercise in, workout. The rest of the time I was home, started to work a second job. And Trish, my wife, throughout her years, would do little things like she worked at a daycare every now and then, so she could try to stay close with the kids, not actually have them in daycare. At that time, it was just me working another job on the weekends. And then as T-Mobile grew, they also evaluated the fact that most of their supervisors and managers were underpaid. And so I was fortunate enough to start to see some pay increases. And then I was promoted to team manager for another position I applied. So I got a bump there. And once I got the team manager position, the pay had right-sized enough that we were in a better position at that point where all I was doing was T-Mobile. And even though it was Albuquerque, so the cost of living is really low, but we even figured out like we were able to save just enough money, and through some first-time home buyers program, we bought our first home in Albuquerque when I was a team manager. And that's when my career started to grow a little bit more. But it was a sequence of events of making a lot of luck involved, but making the right decision at the right time, because the pay cut was coming. I was just like, there's no way it's not. There's too many conversations. I could just hearing the conversations and seeing where the company was going. I was like, I just got to decide. Either I need to go do something else, or if I'm going to make this my career, then I need to start.
Yeah. And now you're easily one of the most successful people in our family, which I want to speak to for a moment. Another piece of pandering. And for anybody listening, Farhan and I don't have a relationship that lends itself to compliments very well. So you're gonna sense the awkwardness here, but you were the driving force behind almost every familial event any of us experienced for, I'd say, like a 15-year epoch. And I've thought about this a little bit when I knew I was going to do this podcast with you. I call it forcing family. Like, you dragged us, like kicking and screaming, and you would do things on the periphery too. I always got a phone call from you checking in, asking me questions. How are you doing? You always use your drive time really effectively. But like family barbecues, birthdays, any get-togethers that we did, 99 out of 100 of them were because you and Trish not just like made the offer, but also kind of insisted on it. And you did it for everybody in our extended reach. And you even roped in some people that aren't family by blood, let's say, but ended up kind of becoming family. You did it with your in-laws. You did it with some of your closest friends. And looking back at the time, I had no appreciation for it. It actually annoyed me. I'm 16 years old. I want to go hang out. I'm like, I got to go Farhan's house, because if I don't, he's going to bully me. But looking back, I'm A, grateful, but B, man, I'm fatigued at thinking about you doing all of this. You've got your job the way that 2, 3, 4 jobs. You have your own children. You have your wife, but it wasn't the nucleic family. I don't want to say that wasn't enough, because of course that's enough, but you also wanted like more. You wanted like a broader circle, a broader community, and you just made that happen in a really bullish fashion. So I'd love to know more about your mindset and why that was so critically important.
Yeah, we talked a little bit about my mom had individual conversations with my dad and my older brother and me, and so certainly also like my brother and I've talked over time, but some of the things that she said to me was, uh, right, hey, stick to school. She really wanted me to get my degree.
Which,
She
just
said,
for the listener, you did. You went to Pepperdine.
I did. Yes, I did. But I did it in my 40s.
Yeah. Well, that's what was funny is you were already rich. I was like, dude, what are you doing? Why are you putting yourself through this? But I realize now, okay, it's for mom, it's for, posterity, maybe.
Yes, it was important. It was important for my resume, and I did get T-Mobile. T-Mobile was great enough to where they actually paid for it as well. So I paid for some expenses, paid for books, paid for some things like that, but they paid for the bulk of the 100% of the tuition and all of those things, which was amazing. And going back, I went back as a director. I was already a director. And I went back at that time for all the reasons that you just said, right? It was important to me personally. And it was one of those things that helped fulfills that conversation that I had with my mom, literally on her deathbed. The other thing that she said was take care of the family. Specifically, like she called out Haas and my younger brother because of how young he was, and she also said stay away from drugs and alcohol. So just for context, I've never drank anything, so I've never had any alcohol. I've never had drugs of any sort. Even though I grew up in an environment where that stuff was readily available, all my friends had access to it. I usually left right when all that stuff came out, which I think probably saved my life to some degree. And being young, I did it all because, like, okay, I promised my mom, literally on her deathbed, that I'm not going to do this stuff. And so I would leave. I had a best friend that was really supportive. So like when people tried to pressure me, he was right there, like threatening people to shut the hell up, and he knew the backstory. And there would be all sorts of things that happened, like bad stuff that happened that I just missed out on because I just wasn't there. So those three things, the family part. Now that part was interesting because there were two driving forces. There was my mom about emphasizing how important family was, and then there was me and my wife who had made a commitment to, like, how do we create a loving environment? And one of the things I picked up on pretty early was that uh, family that you choose is way better, because I wanted to surround myself with people that I truly cared about, and people like my mom or like other people that I respected, and I wanted them in my life. And so for me, it was never drawing lines of blood or not blood. If you were blood and you're an asshole, you probably weren't coming to the house for the barbecue. But if you were the type of person that had similar values and we lined up, then you're right. Like sometimes it drove Trish a little crazy too, because I was like, hey, listen, for the amount of time that I work, I want the kids to know that they have an extended family environment, that there's people that care about them. And I wanted to create as loving and as a supportive environment as I could, especially in those times that I wasn't working. And so that's why there was this emphasis on trying to make sure that it isn't just my family, but it's connecting some of the bigger lines and giving context to my kids about what that's like. When my mom was alive, she always kept in touch with a lot of other people. And because so many people thought highly of her, I just remember as a kid, some of the best moments we had in the States, because I was born in Pakistan, came to the States when I was 5, was when we went to some of those places and there was a bunch of other kids around and multiple families, and we just hung out and had a good time. So that experience at home versus after her passing were the things that I was trying to recreate, because it was just an important moment in my growing up. It was important to know that there was other people out there that were, similar in approach, similar in what they were trying to do, and just knowing that you're a part of something bigger and there's other people out there that you can connect with. So it was always very high on my priority list to make sure that we connected with our family, and we did it very intentionally and very purposefully to create an environment that let the kids know that there's a lot of people that you should stay connected with and you should build relationships with. And it takes effort. Like, it just doesn't happen.
Yeah, the effort piece. That's so true. It's a hard thing to fall into. I mean, even if you live right next door to your brother and everybody's there, it's so easy to just live inside of your little igloo. I want to talk about your children for a moment. My wife and I put a trust together, and part of the trust is deciding who our kids go to if we kick the bucket, God forbid. And I called you and your wife and said, "Hey, do y'all mind being on that list?" And I don't know if you know this, but the sequence of events, we had just gotten finished spending some time with y'all, and me and Susie were just so impressed with your kids. Like, I feel like, there's people out there that, love on their kids well enough, but the output isn't always something that I'd necessarily want to replicate. You know what I mean? And what's funny about your children is, especially for maybe the Caden for sure, who's your youngest, but I'd like to say all of them, I feel like they're more Seattle than they are Albuquerque. Is that fair to say?
Yeah.
So
Absolutely.
they're more like, rich kids, white collar job, got cars early, paid for all those things, than they are government cheese. And yet they didn't come out that way. They came out humble, hardworking, for the most part. But the thing that I love about all three of your kids is, and this is, I think, maybe the biggest compliment I could play to any human, because this is, I think, the hardest thing for a human to cultivate, is all three of them has such a strong sense of self. Like Nassim, who's your eldest, is a wrecking ball, who just, like, she wanted to run, so she decided to run. And now I don't know how many 5Ks she's ran around the world, and she travels and does those things. And Jordan, who's a little more reticent and kind of shy, maybe is a good characterization, but if you get him going, man, like, talk to him about music or cars, and, like, the kid knows, and he has his own interests and his own, again, sense of self. And then Caden, your youngest, probably could have been a professional soccer player, at least could have played like minor leagues, maybe still can. Insanely confident, but in a really, really calm way. And so I'm curious, and maybe it just happened, maybe there's no formula, but knowing what I know about you and how intentional you are, I'm curious how you instill that in children. Like, where did that come from? How much of that do you think was your cultivation and them just doing it? Because if it was just one kid, I'd say fluke, nature, not nurture. But given that you got 3 out of 3, and I don't think I've seen anybody else with those odds, I'm going to assume that there's a lot of nurture there.
I think, like, it's so funny because I always tried to figure out, like, what the recipe is, right? Like, how can you rinse and repeat? And I don't think I ever did. I think it was a constant evolution of figuring out who they were, evolving myself. But I think what's most important is you just always have to do the work to understand and identify how you're evolving as a person, how they're evolving as a person, and what are the various things that you can do to help build that environment. And I think one of the things that I tried to do, at least in a couple of different ways, was I always wanted to make it easy for them to communicate. Now, there's always varying degrees of success. Jordan was the king of I don't know, and that's really all you could get out of him. So the conversation really didn't go so far. Like, he did not want to dive into a deep thought process. And now, to your point, like he does earlier, but it always takes a little bit. Like, he's a little bit more private. Like my wife, she's like, she'll talk about all the superficial facts you want, but the second you start to dig a little deeper, there's a lot of resistance, and it takes a little bit to open up. Nassim's the opposite. She'll jump into everything.
Oh, you can't stop her.
Yes. Yes. And I think, like, throughout the years, I always tried to do different things. I tried several different things to have the kids communicate in different ways and at varying times. I did everything from this was way early. Now everything's done on PowerPoint, and I know we're evolving to other tools like Figma and other stuff, but PowerPoint was still relatively starting, where people were figuring out that this is how we're going to communicate at work and do some of those things. And I made the kids do a presentation and pull it together on all 3 of them, help them if they needed help as far as, like, building the PowerPoint, but it was their content. It was what they wanted to talk about. and it was them sharing their top 5 most impactful things to their lives. And I'm like, you just talk about whatever the hell you want to talk about. And we learned some interesting things because we had
How old
moved.
were they when you did this? I'm sorry, just
Oh, no worries. Nassim was about 14 or 15. Jordan was about 12, 11, 12. And then Caden was like, he was about 6 or 7. So
and you've done this a lot. So, I mean, I've been at family events where everybody had to do a presentation. So this was the first one. And then I interrupted you. Keep going.
No, you're good. And so had them go through this. And the reason I did is because we had just moved to Seattle. And I was like, we hadn't been there too long. And I was like, I want to get a sense for what they're feeling. And they're saying everything is great. But it was really interesting to hear about how Nassim talked about how often she had to change schools. And she positioned positive aspects of it. Jordan talked about how often he had to switch schools. And he focused on some of the negative aspects of it. And then Caden, of course, he had been in pretty much the same school so far. And so for us, it became a priority to say, all right, we've moved a lot. Now we're going to, like Caden, we're going to try to keep him in as much of the same school system as we can. And he was fortunate enough to where once we moved to Issaquah, he went through that system. He went through Covington School District for a little bit. And then when he came to Issaquah, he graduated from Issaquah High School, and he was able to make some long-lasting friendships. And it was actually really important that we tried to minimize that impact on him as a result of that single conversation. And then I did things like I had them journal one summer where we kept a journal of different thoughts and shared on the weekend, and all varying degrees. I've had them write an essay. It's funny. This is my favorite for my boss at work, who I have a really great relationship with. She always gives me crap about this, but I had them write an essay on Christmas about why they deserve presents. And it wasn't like, I was just like, just tell me, like, what do you want? You get presents all the time. So what does it mean? I always told them, hey, Santa Claus isn't real. Not because for me, I was just like, I'm always going to have an open and honest conversation with you. I don't want to start with I told you there was this person named Santa Claus for a bunch of years. I'm not faulting anybody that does it. Like everybody follows different things. For me, it was just hard. For me, it just, I was just like, I'm not going to lie to my kids. And that was where it started. And so I was like, I was like, there's no Santa Claus. We don't necessarily celebrate the religious aspect of Christmas. So now tell me, like, why you deserve presents. And they all wrote essays. They hated it. And it seems the one that looks back now and going, yes, I love it. I'm going to do that with my kids. The boys are like, yeah, no, I don't ever want to do that again. And then I've also had them do things like, after the essay, I was like, okay, now here's your budget. You guys pick what you want. You have to submit it to me in Excel. And I'm a big math person. I love math. So I was like, if the math's wrong, you're not getting anything. I have an empty threat, but they didn't really realize it at the time. But it was great because the kids, like the boys, pooled their money, because I was like, you can do whatever you want. And they pooled their money, and they wanted a Nintendo Wii, and they wanted all this other stuff. And I was like, you can give money away. You can do whatever. And they had $50 left over, and they said, we're going to donate that to charity. And I was like,
no way.
That totally exceeded my expectations, even though they hated it.
Yeah. What charity did they donate to?
That they left it up to me. They just said charity. They just said, give it to charity.
At that age, that's about what it is, right? It's like charity is just this big bucket that we all send our money to, and then it makes it to where it needs to go.
Yeah. So I think the biggest thing, was always finding different ways to communicate and hearing from them and helping them develop their own voice. Because some of the things that we learned is, even though Jordan was a little bit more closed off, he was very creative in his writing. He did poems really well. He enjoyed poetry, and he expressed himself in writing really well. I don't know that we ever would have thought of that, but I never would have, with all the I don't knows. I was like, Jesus, like, just talk to me, kid. Right. And so it was really interesting. And then you evolve over time. And it was funny because Nassim the other day was saying that her friend was confused as to why Nassim was grounded a lot. And both Trish and I were like, we didn't think you were grounded a lot. And Nassim was like, oh, I have no trauma from it. It was all associated with not turning in assignments and whatever. But it was funny because by the time I got to Caden, and that's why I say it always changed. By the time I got to Caden, and Caden went through a cycle of where they were all smart, which also got them a little bit lazy because they could always figure stuff out. And then when they had to apply themselves to get an assignment done, there were sometimes waited till the last minute, didn't do it as well, wouldn't tell us. And then they'd have missed assignments, and we'd be like, hey, why aren't we having a conversation? And with Caden, it was really funny because I remember, and he'll probably remember it differently, but I sat him down and I just said, he was in high school, and I was like, hey, you've got about 3 missed assignments in a row. And I was like, listen, I'm never going to punish you. I'm done grounding. I'm done yelling. Like, like all that stuff to me now, based on where I'm at, is dumb. I just want to align with you. Like, tell me how I can help you. Like, what are your goals? Like, why aren't you turning in the assignments? Like, do you want to go down? You want to change classes? You want to do something different? Like, you tell me. Like, let's just get on the same page and let's figure out how we row in the same direction. Because I'm like, what's the point in grounding you? Like, let's just dumb, like, right? Like, let's just figure out how we can, like, let's figure out what we want to achieve together. I'm okay if you say you hate class, but like, figure out a way to do assignments that's more creative or whatever, right? And so I think some of those things, as they evolved over time, I always did a lot of different things in different ways to try to, my intention was to try to help them find their voice. And I found that I always learned something about them in the process. So then I kept coming up with different versions. It was really funny because Trish, at one point, I always included us because I was like, we're going to ask them to do it. We have to do it. And I remember Trish one time was like, why the hell am I getting homework if the kids are getting, just do it with them?
But which exercise is that? Which one didn't she want to do?
That was the summer journal. The whole summer, we read the same book. That summer it was Ender's Game. We had to like relay and write our thoughts about what we got from it. And I was like, listen, you guys be whatever religion you want. I just want you to tell me something you learned that week about theology. And then I just want you to tell me a little bit of what you did to try to make yourself smarter this week, and then grade yourself on your effort, right? And that was always funny because I'm always been a harsh grader. So they're giving themselves A's and I'm like, oh, you gotta be kidding. It's like an F, maybe a D minus. Right. But let's talk about that grading scale. But that was the summer journal. That was the one that Trish was like, and she's a little guarded too. So she's like, well, I don't want to do this.
That's so funny. If you don't mind, just a brief departure, because you mentioned religion, which I struggle with. I have no theological commitments to give my children. And I feel like that's a pretty massive hole. You're not what I would characterize as a distinctly religious person, but I would characterize you as maybe very devout. You've prayed for as long as I've known you. You don't talk about your religious beliefs unless prompted, but I know it's important to you. And yet you didn't do the indoctrination thing with your kids. Mm-hmm. Instead, you said, like, almost best of luck to you, figure it out. And I'm curious, especially for the religious types, I've always noticed a sense of desperation. Like, my kids need to believe the thing that I believe, and you don't seem to have that at all.
No. And, and to your point, everyone interprets religion differently. I had a professor from Pepperdine express this, and I always thought it was really great because even rather than just saying explicitly religion, I've always expressed it as taking care of myself has always taken a context of mind, body, soul. I've always wanted to do something to figure out how to keep learning, whether that's work or personal or whatever. I've always wanted to do something that's about keeping my body healthy and exercising in some form or fashion, eating right, those types of things. And then I've always wanted to do something spiritually. And for me, I found that in Islam. I'm a practicing Muslim, but there's a lot of the thing the professor had said in Pepperdine that resonated with me really strongly was, some people find spirituality externally, and those are the people that gravitate towards religion and going maybe a little bit harder on religion because they find it externally. And there's some people that find spirituality internally. And for me, that's the case. Like, it has to resonate with you, and you can express it a million different ways. So the only thing I ever emphasized to my kids was, hey, just don't do it apathetically. Don't just say you're Muslim because you think like that's what I want to hear, or say you're Christian because that's what your mom might want to hear, or say that you're agnostic or atheist because it's the easiest path. I'm like, just take a little time to figure out like what's right for you spiritually, and that's it. As long as you can do that with some intentionality, I'm happy, because I want them to find their spirituality internally, If they find it externally, great. But I want them to have a very internal anchor about what is right for them spiritually. And so for me, it was really easy. I have had that conversation with them for a long time. In the summer journal where they kept theology, I was like, read whatever you want. You want to, like, Nassim went to Bible study with some of her friends. I've been to Christmas Mass. I've been to churches. I've been to temples. I've been to it's a little bit like if anyone's read or watched Life of Pi, the little Indian kid describes himself as a Christian, Muslim, Hindu. And I'm like, I describe myself as like a Christian, Muslim, Buddhist, because there was a ton of things I read about Buddha that resonated for me as well. But I just think like that was the emphasis to my kids was like, mind, body, soul, whatever aspect you want, find the way you want to take care of yourself. And you decide if there's something greater that you want to latch yourself onto, or if you want to believe that there isn't, or whatever your beliefs are. I just wanted them to manifest that for themselves.
You mind if we do a little rapid fire?
Yeah.
Not all of these questions are necessarily rapid fire, so if they can't be truncated, we can skip. But curious, what's the biggest challenge you faced as a father, and how'd you overcome it?
It's funny because I think the biggest challenge was retrospectively. Like one of the things that I started to identify later was with Jordan. I was a little bit harder on him. He was the middle kid. Caden was the baby. Nassim was the daughter. And so I was a little bit harder on him than I needed to be. So there was a little bit more like I pushed him more than the other two kids. And so I was identifying that I wasn't developing as strong a bond with him as I wanted. And over the years, right, he moved out. Like I encouraged them to move out. I wanted them to go establish like kind of their own identity. But he was the one where I was most worried that maybe there would not be a connection. And how do you right that ship? Because at this point, he's moved out, he's over 18. And a lot of it was dealing with some of those regrets that I had based on the times that I was maybe less accepting and maybe pushed him a little bit when I should have put my arm around his shoulder and told him everything was going to be all right. Didn't do as much of those things to support him, and trying to figure out how do you right that ship. I talked about it with some friends and with some folks. You and I have chatted about it before. And like I just tried to be there for him as he got older. And I knew that I needed to let him process some of those things and decide where our relationship was going to go. And then not having a relationship with my dad after my mom passed. And even now, he lives with my younger brother, but I don't necessarily have a connection with him or a conversation with him. So I never developed. My mom passed away when I was 13. Then I'm kind of on my own. I didn't really have a good relationship of what a relationship with adult kids are going to be like, right? I had no blueprint for it because I was like, oh, like they just go away, right? Like you just, you're on your own. So I think that was probably the biggest challenge because there's a little bit of obviously differences between how they grow up and how you stay connected. So I think similar to what I said before, I'm still figuring that part out and figuring out how to stay close to them, because I think I have a proclivity to be a little bit too passive. And then Trish is usually the one that's like, hey, have you talked to them lately? Have you reached out? Right. I'm almost like I'm waiting for them to sort of figure out what relationship they want to have with me. But there's always this balance of like, how do we do that? But the good news is Jordan now is back home. He reached out to Trish and I and he didn't want to go to school right away after high school, but he decided to wants to go back to school, is going back to school for computer programming, asked if he could come back and live at home and go do that. And I had those moments to be very supportive and be like, heck yeah, come on down. Like
I love that. He's in class. He's in school now.
Yeah.
How's that going?
It's going well. Like he's taken he's not pushing himself too hard in the sense of like, he needs to get through his associates and then he needs to go focus and take a bunch of math classes. So he could take a heavier schedule. Our niece, Anaya, my older brother's daughter, who is very studious, drives her nuts every time she talks, where she's like, just go to school all day. He's paced himself, and he's paced himself slower than I would. But part of at least me getting older and just understanding him a little bit more, I'm like, go at exactly the pace you need to. It'll be fine. Right? You'll get there. So we met with an advisor just the other day to kind of chart out the rest of his time. It's going to take him 2 to 3 years longer than maybe if he did it full time or pushed a little harder. But at least now as I get older, I'm just like, it's fine. Like, we'll figure it out.
There's a compliment my wife paid you. We had breakfast with y'all, and she asked about Nassim, and you started just rattling off. You're like, oh, she's taking this class and she doesn't like this one. She might drop that one. She thinks she wants to do this. She's going to go. And like, we got into the car, and Susan's like, he knows everything about his daughter. He knows what she's doing. And Suzanne said, my parents never knew like what I was. They didn't know what city I was in. And you like, just pay attention. And it, I mean, even you talking about Jordan just now, I think that's credit to you. What's your greatest triumph as a father?
I don't know. I tend to, it's funny because earlier I mentioned optimism when I looked at other people, I think, and we talked a little bit about grading scale. I'm always a little bit harder on the grading scale when I look at myself. So like calling something a triumph is a challenge. Like, I don't know that I have any single thing that I would point to as a triumph. And there's plenty of areas that I think I could have done a lot better. But I think I'll allude a little bit to what you had started to say. And that's the other thing, right? It's not really like my triumph. Like, I've never been that worried about how much money the kids make, or how far they go in school, or what they wind up working in. I've always wanted them to be good people. And if there's anything, I'll change the question to what am I most proud of? And I think it's just the people that they are, and the fact that they have like genuine goodness in their hearts, and the things that I see them do, and how they carry themselves is something that I'm like, that's pretty awesome. Like, that's it. Like, I'm good. Like, whatever happens here, like, let's go. It's gravy.
Last question. What advice would you give to new fathers or fathers to be?
Oddly enough, I would just say, like, there's probably two things. Like, one, and it ties to like when you asked what was challenging. I think as a new father, we talked about it. It was very challenging for me to not look at their events, reactions, and actions based off my perspectives. So just knowing that their child has completely different perspectives, being a place of and a person of accepting them more than anything else. They'll have plenty of people in this world that are going to challenge them. So if you just start from letting them know, like, you accept and love them, and I think that's the most important thing. And everything else will take care of itself. Just have a little grace on yourself as well. Just keep trying. Just do the work. Like, it's really funny because I'll do the analogy with baseball. I hate baseball, but it's the perfect analogy for being a dad. Because if you're a great baseball player, your batting average is in the 200s. Like, you fail 3 out of 4 times at bat, and it's great. Right. So I'm just like, like, you just have to remember that part. Do the work. Your batting average has to be in the 200s, and you're great. So there's going to be plenty of things you do wrong. Just keep learning from it. And it's never too late to evolve and change. So that's probably the biggest part. Have a little grace on yourself. You don't have to be perfect. You just have to try to be in the 200s.
I love that, man. This has been awesome fun. If people wanted to connect with you, I know you're not knee deep in social media, but I imagine you're on LinkedIn, right? Like, that's a prerequisite for you corporate types.
Yeah, although in all fairness, like, I don't think I've looked on there for a year. But yes, I am on LinkedIn, and I go every now and then. I'll see something, and I'll go check it. So I don't check it very often, but LinkedIn, I am on LinkedIn. Yes.
Yeah. Well, this has been a blessing. I appreciate you being as open and honest as you were. If you're listening, I don't know if Roman's even going to keep this in. He might end up editing it out, but I just want to put a plug in for the brotherhood. There's Front Row Dads, the podcast, but then there's Front Row Dads, I call it a mastermind, the brotherhood, the membership, whatever you want to call it. And it is an unbelievable resource. It's been insanely impactful for me. And it's conversations like this, but on a recurring basis. And you habituate the idea of working on being a father and being a husband and being a family man. And without the brotherhood, I don't think I'd be in a space where I could do that consistently. I'm in a band of 3 other guys. We meet every week now, which is pretty intense. They do regular summits, bring in massive names as thought leaders, in-person events. It couldn't be more impactful or a greater value. So if you're looking for a home, if you're looking for a community, if you're looking for a tribe of men that also want to push themselves to be better, I hope you'll consider it. Otherwise, just keep listening, because, John's always going to have other great voices, just like Farhan's. Farhan, again, thank you so much for coming. And can't wait to see how this is received.
Yeah, thanks, man. I appreciate it.